This morning, we've taken a 1-week break from Malachi, which makes me sad because the prophets are like my favorite to preach. But I think that as we have our Swahili congregation with us once a month, I think it's important for us to together be able to talk about our values and be able to talk about what it looks like to be a church that comes together and a church that's intercultural. And so when we're together, the sermons might be a little more teachy than preachy, but hopefully they become a part of our ethos and a part of us together. Understanding one another and learning what it looks like to worship together. I have decided to follow Jesus. Those words in the early church were not considered by everyone to be enough. They were not quite enough to suggest that one had authentically decided to follow Jesus. They weren't enough for people to affirm someone as belonging to the community of faith. They weren't enough as people wondered if to be a Christ follower was sufficient without adherence to specific moral and religious codes, those things that had been built into their cultural landscape. And from our perspective, that might seem a little bit harsh and judgmental, maybe lacking some theological backing, but I want you just to put yourself in their frame of mind. I want you to imagine if for your entire life that the one thing you knew that the one thing you understood that connected you and helped you to be recognized as someone who follows God was the food that you ate, the type of fabrics that you wore, the way that you celebrated the Sabbath, the different festivals and rituals, circumcising your male children, avoiding certain spaces, and not eating with specific people. And then one day you hear from all of those trusted spiritual leaders and guides that seemingly out of the blue, those rules no longer apply. The very things that you had built your foundation of faith on, that which you had passed on to your children and hoped for your grandchildren, are now spoken about as optional. Those things that you were once praised for leaving out are now the very people that you're invited to include, that you're invited to welcome to the table and to welcome into the faith. And your resistance to participate in that which you see as ungodly is then met with disdain and rebuke. Of course, it would be full of discomfort. You might feel unsettled. You might feel uncertain. You might feel that the most important thing you can do is hold tight to the past, to reteach former ways of being, because it appears that those who are leading have lost their way. And to cling to the familiar and those things that have become sacred to you feel like they're the only thing that matters. What was and what is begin to clash. Now, we have a lot of idealism about the early church, and some of it has its place. I mean, after all, we hear these stories of thousands coming to faith, fire falling from heaven, families sharing what they have with one another, everything is held in common. Those stories are both remarkable and aspirational. However, we would be amiss to forget that the early church was also a space where there was conflict. There was also a space where there was division and marginalization, judgment, and all kinds of assumptions. There were those who had walked with Jesus and had been witnesses of the crucifixion and the resurrection. There were those who had watched Jesus ascend to the Father and bore witness to the Holy Spirit come down. There were the Hebraic Jews, there were those who were Greek by birth, but who had converted to Judaism later on, and then further to Christianity. And then there were those who had come to faith, leaving behind the worship of their Greek and Roman gods. And for all of their differences, there is this one thing that unites them. Each of them had decided to follow Jesus. Romans 14 meets the church in the midst of these differences and uses the language of weak and strong, a word picture to help explain the divisions formed because of their differences and their diversity. J.R. Kirk notes in his book on Romans that there's a rift in the community, as we've seen Paul is addressing Gentiles throughout the letter who are suddenly confronted with having to figure out how to relate to those Jews whose story they have adopted, especially those who follow Jesus. In other words, the Romans are new to this idea of worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't have a history with this God as their Jewish brothers and sisters do. The idea of a God of covenant, the practices of eating and worshiping connected with this God are foreign to them. The expectations of a Messiah revealed in Jesus are all new concepts to these people. And so we might imagine that it would be the group who were new to the story, who would struggle with leaning into Jesus as who and what defines their faith and their relationship with God. But instead, it is those who come from this long history and tradition of worship who struggle to believe that following Jesus is enough. And after centuries of tradition and teaching that have shaped how they think and respond and connect with God, when the new guys come in, they come in without any protocol. They come in without all of the pomp and circumstance that the people are accustomed to, and it is easy to question their faith. Not because they're enacting violence, not because they're leaning more and more into the empire or participating in acts of oppression or injustice. Rather, it's because of their Gentile Christian brothers and sisters' refusal to identify with Sabbath, refusal to participate in circumcision, and refusal to eat the food that they think that they should eat. And their tensions begin to demonstrate their capacity to undo the early church, to remove their eyes from following Jesus, to create factions and favorites. But Paul understood that what they were trying to do was create a new kind of community. His letter to the church was not intended to remind both the Gentile and Jewish Christians who struggled to accept one another that they have to agree on all things, or that they have to come to consensus on a preferred outward practice. Instead, the church is invited to be something completely different. Where hierarchy, where division, those who are in and those who are out, where the rules of the empire of Caesar, where the rules of the marketplace and the rules of religiosity reigned free, Paul longed for this group of Christians to be redefined and united by their decision to follow Jesus. And so he insists that the church is intended to be a new kind of community, a new kind of family where the Grecian Jews and the Hebraic Jews, the Romans and the Corinthians, those from Antioch and those from Crete, those from Jerusalem, those who required the rules and those who were liberated from the rules, and those who decided they could write new rules, that they could all worship together, that they could be on mission together, that they could eat together, that they would see the image of God in one another. A new kind of community was set before them, but the differences between them weighed heavily and often sought to crack the foundations that they were being built on. And so Paul gives them this imagery. He says, I want you to accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what you think is right or wrong. And he uses the example of food. The Gentile Christians are accustomed to a certain way of eating and drinking that doesn't align with the Jewish Christians. And so when they would gather, as they would gather together to worship as followers of Jesus, the question of what was being served at the table of fellowship, who was eating, and where the food came from were very important to some and not at all important to others. And Paul reminds his readers that for those whose faith remains connected to those outward practices as confirmation of holiness, in contrast with those who are simply fine with the statement, I have decided to follow Jesus, remember, God has accepted them. And in the end of all things, God is the one who will walk with them as they undo some things, as they let go of some things, and as they take hold of new paradigms. In other words, while you are struggling to know who is in and who is out, God has already accepted those you are tempted to exclude. God has already identified with those you disagree with, and God is already at work within the lives of those whose worship and practices may be different than your own. And so if God can accept them, despite all of the ways that they are different from you, perhaps it's time that you do the same. He goes on to say, we live to honor God. So why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on them? Stop condemning them. Instead, live in such a way that you do not cause another to stumble. Kirk writes it like this. He says, if you want to be like Jesus, then you need to see that God is present even in the weaker sibling. Accept them. Be like Jesus in a world where Rome ruled. This was the strongest possible admonition for Christian Gentiles to love the Jewish people among them as a physical embodiment of the presence of God. Here at West Springs, we are a diverse community. And that diversity is represented in all different kinds of ways, from our social economic statuses. There's a range to that. Where we live in the city, people come from all over. From the countries that have formed us, the cultures that have upheld us. Our diversity includes individuals who are disabled, those whose first language is not English, those who are multilingual and have lived in many locations. There are those who've grown up in charismatic settings, those who come from a Catholic background, and those who even come from Reformed traditions. And then we also have those longtime Free Methodists, such as me. Yet here we are, a community of believers who worship together and ones who are united by our desire to know Christ and to be known by Christ. But the temptation remains, even among us, to forget that the image of God is reflected in the person beside us, regardless of their preferences, regardless of the way that they worship or the ways that they seek to embody holiness, the places they may have come from or the places they are walking towards. Yet the image of God is made manifest in them and comes to life in all of us when we engage together as ones who have chosen to seek out and to follow Jesus. And so I want you to pause for a moment. I want you to do something that's not going to be comfortable. Maybe I should even make you stand up. Stand up. I want you to physically turn your body and look at someone who's didn't come with you. Look at them. Look at someone. Sorry for those who this is your first time here. I don't do this every week. All right, you can sit down. I want you to note that each eye that you catch, that each person you saw, that the voices you heard, that the smiles that were returned to you, that each of them are a person who most likely sees some aspect of their Christianity differently than you do. Yet that same person you saw or you shook hands with or you smiled at, that same person follows Jesus. Maybe through a different lens, maybe from another perspective, but that person belongs to God. And that person knows that God belongs to them. And together we can announce that we are all created in the image of God. And so while we may agree on that point, it can still be hard sometimes to come together. It may still be difficult to accept that someone's views of a certain text or scripture are different, that their ideas about what's appropriate are different, that their style or preference of worship or what gathering looks like is different. And somehow we have to come to believe that those differences are not equated with whether or not that person has decided to follow Jesus. When Jesus stood in front of the most religious in the book of Matthew, one of his corrections to them was that they were like cups that were clean on the outside but filthy on the inside. And the message was this: to look good, To meet all of the outward religious do's and don'ts is not what makes you a follower of Jesus. Likewise, when the outer edges of the cup may have some imperfections, but the inside is then made clean, it is also not a sign that the inside is not clean, that the person is not a follower of Jesus. And that can be really difficult to decipher, especially when much of our formation, at least mine was back in the 80s and 90s, much of our formation was so centered on outward actions rather than on inward change. But our faith is not defined by what we can see and what we can measure. It's not only defined by what we can quantify or what we can design. Instead, what truly matters is those things that God measures, that God sees, and the ways that God so uniquely designs and defines us. So we need not wonder if the person beside us knows God the same way as we do, or if their holiness is enough, because frankly, they know God differently. And their understanding of holiness may be just growing and emerging, or something that has been established through decades of study and connection with God. Instead, we are invited to a new way forward. We are invited to trust God with our stories of faith. We're invited to trust God with our formation. And then we're invited to believe that if God is at work in our stories, if God is at work in us despite all that is imperfect about us, those things that only we know are imperfect within us, whether that's outward or inward, yet we know that we are being refined. We understand that we are being restored. We understand that we are being shaped and made. Then perhaps we ought to be able to trust that same God with the person beside us. When we trust God in our faith journey, it calls us to trust that God is at work in the journey of the person beside us. It's easy to look back and be bolstered by how God has carried us. But when your faith was weak and the way that God carried you, when your ideas about God were small and unformed, but God was still with you, it's easy to remember that for ourselves, but we have to offer that same courtesy to our brothers and our sisters. Sometimes it's easy to imagine that what God did for you cannot be done for another. But as our trust in God gets more expansive, we find ourselves in the presence of those who are like us and those who are quite different from us, with this notion that just as God is at work in me, so is God at work in you. And in that way, we reflect the story of God. And so in this space of growing to trust in God, that we are made to no longer be comfortable evaluating the person beside us only by what we see. Instead, we are given a new way forward, which includes the invitation to trust that the God who sees us and knows us is the same God who sees them and knows them. And something really significant happens when we move into a trust mindset. Suddenly, the responsibility to ensure that they are as we deem they should be is no longer up to us. We are made free from the need to make someone become like us for fear that if they don't, we might have to condemn them or judge them. Instead, we are invited to simply pay attention. To pay attention as we pray, to pay attention as we build relationships, to pay attention to where the Spirit is leading and what Jesus is inviting us into. And suddenly, you are not there to police the person beside you. You're not there to condemn the one sitting across from you. You're not there to change the person behind you. Rather, you are simply invited to become a spiritual sojourner who walks alongside the humans that we are called to. And as the Spirit leads, we discover that our role with the person beside us is to become a companion, Someone who participates in the slow and patient work of relationship building, of prayer, of listening and engaging with those whose perspectives may not be our own and may even make us uncomfortable. But somehow in the mix of it all, we are mutually formed and shaped, and we mutually are guided as we encounter Christ in the person beside us, and they are able to encounter Christ in us. But then here's the question. Evangelicals like this one a lot. But what if they're wrong? What if they need to be corrected? What if they're doing the wrong thing? And to that, I think the invitation still stands for us to take a posture of asking questions, to prayerfully consider where they are in their journey, to trust that God is at work within them, and to be that companion who walks with them, as one who participates with what God is doing in them, rather than as one who imagines that they must become God to them. That is not our responsibility. In other words, even when we are compelled to walk with someone who needs some reformation or is in need of refinement, even there we lean into Jesus, trusting that God is at work in them, just as God is at work in you. And as our trust grows from being just about us to including those around us, suddenly I am made free to both form and participate in this new kind of family. I am now made free to be a part of this new kind of community that Paul longs for in the book of Romans, and you'll see it again in the book of Galatians. A church community made up of different people and different voices and different backgrounds and ideas, but who are united on this single thing, which is their connection and relationship with Jesus. When I was in my 20s, some of you may know that I moved to Nova Scotia and I taught there for 2 years. And there I had this eclectic group of friends. I had my teacher friends who I worked with. I had lots of African Nova Scotian friends who've been part of Nova Scotia for generations. I had some really good friends from Ghana. One was my roommate. I had a very good friend who was like a sister from Nigeria, some from Cameroon, some from Cote d'Ivoire. And all together, we would gather, often in my house. And if you were to walk into my little 20-year-old apartment, that was probably not even as big as up to here, the whole thing. And if you were to walk into that, you would have found this little round table that had been, picked up. Maybe, I feel back then we were even willing to get furniture from the garbage. I think you grow out of that at some point, or at least I did. So we had this table. We had all different chairs because you just get the chair you can find, right? You have no money. And I was working at the time, but I still had no money. And so I had all of these different chairs at the table. And if you were to go into my living room, there was a couch that one of my friends found and brought to me. I don't know where she found it, but it worked. I had a chair that we refurbished together. And then we had these small stools and pillows that had been collected from all of these different places. And we would gather at my house at least once a week, and we would sit together with all of our different perspectives and ideas and do what you do when you're in your 20s, which is stay up late, and we would solve all of the world's problems with philosophy. I think I still do that today, but now it's just my husband has to listen to me talk about it. But what was beautiful is that as soon as everyone would come and sit down and get comfortable, everything that made the setup unique and mismatched became this beautiful tapestry of human connection. It became this beautiful space of laughter and food from around the world and conversations that sparked curiosity. The setup and the people were all so diverse and mismatched even. The furniture was uniquely placed together, but our differences came together as a space that was all about belonging. That picture is what the early church was, a table of mismatched chairs and unlikely people coming together to form a new community of belonging, despite all that made them different. Jews and Gentiles, the strong and the weak, those who knew the rules and those who didn't, and those who would help to rewrite the rules. And Paul's message was simple: keep sitting together. Keep trusting that God is big enough to hold you all, to shape you all, to form you all, to be present for every one of us. The worship team can come up. We are that same kind of table at our church at West Springs. We don't all match. We come from different spaces and different languages. We come from different experiences and stories, and we have all these different ways of expressing our faith. But the beauty of the table is not in its sameness, rather it's found in the one who invites us to sit down. The beauty of the table is not in its sameness, but it's found in the one who invites us to sit down. And if we trust in God, if we trust that God is at work in the person beside us just as much as in ourselves, and as Wesleyans, we even go so far as to say that God is at work in people even before they can recognize that God is at work in them, then the beauty of our differences becomes the strength of our witness. Trusting in God means trusting that God is at work in others, even when we don't quite understand how. It means believing that the God who is faithful to you is also faithful to them. And so we're going to close with a song. It's called Trust in God. And I hope that it's not just lyrics. I hope it's not just something that you're reciting, but I hope that it becomes a bit of our shared confession. That when we don't see eye to eye, when we don't fully understand the person beside us, when the chairs around the table don't quite match, that we trust in God. We believe that the same God who holds you is the God who holds me. The God who holds them is the God who holds us. And that the same God who began a good work in me and in you and in us is faithful to bring it to completion. Let's stand together. I think those words are really perfect to send us off. This picture of, I trust the Lord, right? I trust God. I sought God and he answered. That's why I trust him. Do we believe that when those around us seek God, that God is answering them? Do we believe that the God who has not failed us is not failing the others? Do we see that because the image of God is present in the person beside us, because God is at work in their story and walking with them on their journey, that we can be free just to meet them, to be these beautiful companions of hope and encouragement, these beautiful companions of discipleship and prayer, these beautiful companions who announce with great delight, you too belong to the same family that I do. This new kind of family that God designed, where all of us who are different, for all of those who come from different spaces and places and ideas can come together and say, we are united on this one thing, that Jesus Christ is the one that I follow. With that in mind, have a wonderful week. I hope you plan to stay for the potluck. Please help Marcy set up and bring a chair. Marcy, I told them.